We Hungarians have no love lost for the Russians. We fought them 5 times in the last 160 years. First, the revolution of 1848-49, then the First World War, then the Social Republic or Soviet Republic of Hungary in 1990, Second World War in 1956. So basically there are no people in Europe except for our friends, the Poles, who have fought Russians more times than we did. But there's a joke about the 200-pound gorilla, 200-kilo gorilla in the movie theater. So there's one thing you can't do with that gorilla. You can't leave its existence out of sight. He will sit wherever he wants. So that's something you have to keep in mind when we discuss these issues. The first one is, I would like to talk about from a strictly military point of view, the tactical and operational experience of the Ukrainian war and the Ukrainian conflict, sorry. The first one is that, unlike tanks are not dead. So whatever you say, that the issues about Javelin and other highly sophisticated missiles have brought a serious threat to armored fighting vehicles, but they haven't made them obsolete. So the combination of firepower, mobility and defense, there are no other military equipment that can provide for the troops. And this very same fact is supported by the pleas of the Ukrainian government. They've asked for tanks and they asked for self-propelled artillery. This is basically, these equipment are that making a presence on the battlefield. And if you speak about artillery, ever since Napoleon, basically, the artillery have caused the most damage on the battlefield. So S.L.A. Marshall, the founder of the Marshall Plan, was also a general. He wrote an excellent book, Men Under Fire, and in that he concluded that the biggest share of losses, of military losses in World War II was caused by artillery. And the same is true again. So even the, how should I say, not so reliable Russian Ministry of Defense have made data available about their losses. We can discuss the numbers, but the proportions are probably true. And 70% of Russian losses are caused by artillery. Probably this is the same issue on the Ukrainian side as well. So basically, classical military thought have not gone extinct, and unlike geopolitics, it has been us all along the way. The second aspect is that everybody is expecting a silver bullet, a Wunderwaffe, something that will solve the military conflict instantly. There is none. Neither drones nor anything else have proven completely decisive. The thing coming closest to a decisive factor was Starlink, nothing else. Because Starlink provided the Ukrainian army with a way of communicate, the way of intelligence, the way of surveillance, which cannot be blocked by the Russians. That's a completely different question, why no Starlink, why there hasn't been any attack on Starlink, either through anti-satellite weapons or through hacking. But the fact is that Starlink still works and helps the Ukrainian defense. And what's more important, that this is something European armies have completely forgotten, that you have to have an air defense system, a layered and redundant air defense system. And the Ukrainian system is still working against the basically daily Russian attacks. And I think yesterday there was an attack which out of 81 missiles, even half, around 40, was still shot down, even though we know that they're slowly running out of anti-aircraft or anti-air missiles. So basically, this war has, on some part, have something new and has some novelty, but on the other hand, is completely old. And basically, on a strategic level, industrial wars are back. It's a sad fact that there is only one Western tank that is produced currently, that is Leopard 2. And it's an astonishingly slow amount of these tanks are made every month, 2 to 5 pieces. On the other side, the Russians are producing 20 to 40 tanks a month. So even though Western tanks are better than Russian ones, this kind of discrepancy, this kind of improportionality cannot be overtaken by sheer quality. The second thing is that on a strategic level, national resilience is very important. What Ukraine is undergoing every day, I have serious doubts that any of our countries would be able to stand up for 1 year. The attacks on the infrastructure, the losses, the military losses, the coffins that come home every day is basically putting a huge strain on the Ukrainian society. And as Frank pointed out, we basically lack the staying power, and Western countries have very little resilience in that sense. So that kind of war of attrition which is going on in Ukraine, we have to ask ourselves how long could be our nations endure it I'm not talking about the United States because it has a habit of a military thinking, and it has a habit of a military, how should I say, posture. But like Frank said, we have a moral disarmament. I would call them mental demilitarization, because armies do not solely consist of military equipment, they also consist of people. And when I first read the news that there was a wave of resigning from the Bundeswehr on the news of the war broke out in Ukraine, I was clearly shocked that those people aren't willing to fight for their country, because there is a just war, the war to defend your country, a just war. And we have to accept that sad fact. And nobody can be more pacifist than a military historian like me, but you have to prepare that you have to defend what you have achieved and your country and your family and your values. We have some good news. The Russians have forgotten how to wage a war. The bad news is that they're starting to relearn it. And we rarely speak that this way or the other, that war will end. And if this war doesn't end with a Russian collapse, then the Russian military threat will be a real one. It will be a real one on our borders, on Polish borders, on Hungarian borders, on the borders of the Baltic Republic. And people don't speak about it, but it's still a fact. If we think about the big picture, a lot of words have been said about the international relations, but we have to face the fact that the old system, called the Westphalian system, which is the basic assumption in the international relations, is falling apart. We can't really talk about national sovereignty, we can't really talk anymore about the exclusivity of violence within the state borders, with the coming of PMCs and other armed groups. We basically face a situation where a state cannot control itself internally. I'm clearly speaking about Europe, but if you think about no-go zones, or you think about clashes like between Kurds and Turks at the airport of Hanover, when more than 100 people were fighting on each side, and it took a police almost 2 hours to restore order. We are completely not prepared for these kind of scenarios. Also, there are no more declarations of war. The last 20-25 wars have started without a declaration of war. And we have come to the point where J.F. Cooper or Karl May described about cowboys and Indians. And we suddenly realize that the Apache tribe have taken the war path. And then we have to prepare ourselves accordingly. So basically the neatly organized lines of declaration of war, military operations, and then the peace accord have vanished. So we have to be prepared for a situation where war can be imminent in any second, basically. That means that the liberal approach to international relations is that the first and only factor which applies in international relations is military power. And it's a sad fact that because of that Europe seems to be a non-player, because we don't really have a military power. And like it or not, this military power has to be rebuilt if we want to take ourselves seriously, and if we want to take other players take ourselves seriously. And that's just with your words, John, nicely, that if Europe wants to be taken seriously, it has to take himself seriously. There's a very famous saying by Kissinger who said that, whom should I call when I want to talk to Europe? And even though we have a special envoy in this area, he still has no authority on European armed forces. And I support a European armed forces, a joint European armed forces, with the one exception that it won't be, let's say, created in a world like this. So it must stand on the national standards, and there should be some parts which are under European control. There's a question regarding, also about the big picture, about the Ukrainian war. What is the exit strategy? And the biggest fallacy NATO have committed is that it has entered military conflicts without a clear exit strategy, a real exit strategy. And my problem is that this time we are not facing Iraqis or Afghanistanis, we are not facing tribal warriors, we are facing a nuclear power. And there's one thing you cannot do with a nuclear power, and there's no moral content in this. You can't force a nuclear power into a corner. And this is something we have to accept. That this way or the other, the Russians still have more than 1,500 nuclear warheads, and we have to take this into consideration. The problem is that for the Russians, and Vladimir Putin has openly spoken about it, for the Russians, Ukraine and the current status of Ukraine is an existential threat, like it or not. We don't have to morally adjust this fact, unfortunately we have to accept it. So if he thinks this is an existential threat, and the mainstream media in Western countries have elevated the Ukrainian conflict also to a level of existential threat, what is the way out? We have to start thinking about this kind of solutions. And in military planning, there are always three courses of action. The first one is the best one, the second one is the worst one, and the third one is the most likely. We have prepared for the best version clearly. We have also prepared for the most likely one. But what about the worst? Has anybody spoken about the worst course of action in the Ukrainian conflict? Unfortunately not. And the last thing what I would like to say is that on the attack on the Nord Stream, we have come to the point where all taboos are broken. So if it is really foolish to think that no attack will happen after the attack on the Nord Stream, whoever had done it, against infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. There were some signs when the North German communication of the railways were destroyed or damaged. But what happens when an LNG ship is attacked, this way or the other? If it blows up, it will have the effect of an atomic weapon. So basically, we have come to an era which is nothing is sacred and nothing is preserved, most likely. So when we discuss this Ukrainian conflict, and I would like to join Frank with this issue, there's a very famous saying by Lord Robertson who said, "We have no eternal allies and have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and it is our duty to follow them." So that would be concluding my remarks, that we have interests and we must follow them, and in order to reach them, we have to find a way back to statecraft and geopolitics. Thank you very much for your attention.